so happy that you're here. I'm glad the weather is a little bit more cooperative than it's been in the last day or so. But welcome to one of our first of our lectures for the new season. And we're excited about things that are coming up here at the East Tennessee Historical Society. And of course, I want to encourage everyone to join. Being a member of the East Tennessee Historical Society is the best way to keep up with the way that what we're doing, what we're offering, and it's a great way to also support what we're able to do. We have incredible partnerships, and that's how we first met Dr. Reed, is our partnership with the University of Tennessee History Department. But we also have lots of other partners around the region, and that's another way to kind of connect with those folks is through membership, and we appreciate all the members that are here tonight. But at any rate, we do have some things coming up, and you can go to our Facebook page for our live presentations when we do have lectures. If you're not able to attend, we try to broadcast those live. Knoxville Community Media allows us to utilize the camera, or oftentimes they're here to film, and so we edit and produce a video to be posted to our YouTube page with the slides kind of integrated in, so that you can look and watch it again later or share it with others, because that's what we're all about, is to share the history and the stories. And we don't want to make sure that even though somebody can't be here physically in that moment, I guess that's one thing post-COVID's done for us, is it's allowed us a lot of access, tools and ways to get these materials out and the research shared. So we do have some upcoming events in April, and I also want to mention the I've Endured Women in Old Time Music exhibition that has been up, and I'm not even sure when we opened it. Things have gone so fast, but we basically have a month left. So it goes through April 19th. So please come take a look at that while we're signing books. If you want to step back and look tonight, you can. But we do have an incredible lecture, Women and the Banjo, by Dr. Christina Gaddy, who will be here on April the 15th at 5:30 at this same time. And she'll be presenting on her study, and she's worked with a lot of musicians, including Rihanna Giddens and others that are traditional banjo, folks that have learned traditionally or more professionally, but folks that are kind of treasuring, especially women's stories and women's musicality with the banjo. And so she will be here on April the 15th as we work towards the end of that exhibition, and then we will be preparing our exhibition that will fit with the 250th, which is really looking at treaties and about the perspectives from the different treaty parties in those stories, and how we remember those things and how we look at them today, looking back, and then how it's been looked at over time. And then we also have on a fun talk, and I cut off the date. April 29th, and this will be a brown bag lecture on bacon, literally bacon, the history of the nation's most desirable food or undesirable. So I guess you have to come and learn more about that. But I think it gets back to hogs, and we all know in East Tennessee that hogs have played a big role in our economy and our culture, way of life, and recipes as well. So, but we have a lot of things coming up. We're really happy also. There are a lot of great things. Please go. We have a brochure about the Tennessee 250. There's a website. There have been probably a total of more than 300 grants that have been allocated across the state to communities, organizations, to produce programs and do archival projects and community projects from the Tennessee 250 Commission. So there's all kinds of things going on during this year. So please take a look at that website for things that are going on in East Tennessee and beyond. And we will continue to look at that. And we will have our history fair back in August for we'll have our internal event that we have, our History Hootenanny event, but we will also be spreading out into the streets around us for a curated history fair to tell more of the stories from communities around East Tennessee, from the 250th, from the founding, from settlement, all the way up to more current years. So, but that's not why we're here today. I just wanted to make sure y'all knew, in the winter we kind of go silent. We kind of go into hibernation, but we're doing that while we're planning and we're getting everything ready to share with you all and have an incredible year. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for the evening. Dr. Julie L. Reed is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation and an associate professor of history and anthropology at the University of Tulsa. Julie's research focus on the Native South, the Five Tribes, Indian Territory, the history of social welfare, and American educational history. Her second book, Land, Language, and Women, A Cherokee and American Educational History, examines 400 years of Cherokee educational history. Flip the page. Through the lives of Cherokee girls studying and learning in very different classroom spaces. Through a Mellon Foundation New Directions Award, this year she is in residence at Western Carolina University, which was very fortuitous for us to bring her over the mountains, studying archaeology and the Cherokee language. With the support of an NEH Collaborative Award, she is currently working on a co-authored book, Sovereign Kin, A History of the Cherokee Nation, with Davidson historian Rose Strimlau. So welcome. We're just excited to hear from you. And I will say we have books, so please check with Tim at the front when we finish, and I'm sure she'd be glad to sign. So thank you for being here with us.
Thank you. It is great to be back. I'm always grateful to be back in places where my work cultivated and that I have relationships with people that I get to thank publicly that I often don't get to thank publicly. And so some of my former colleagues are here tonight. But I also, if you read the acknowledgments in my book, one of those acknowledgments goes out to Dr. Kristen Block, who has been a writing partner dynamo for the last, 8 years now, keeping me on track, setting goals, keeping us both moving forward on projects. And I don't think we often get to tell the people in our lives how much they mean to us and how much they have helped us move forward in ways that maybe don't seem obvious, but are obvious to those of us who couldn't have done it without them. So grateful to see my history department colleagues here, and grateful to be in this place that has been formative to this book project, that truly I could not have written this book without both my time at the University of Tennessee, but also the relationships that I forged with various partners on campus and in the area. So I want to say a little bit about this book and my previous work, because there are some thematic connections, but also some big changes from my larger work. So my first book, just to give you a background, was called Serving the Nation, and it was a history of social welfare institutions and the development of social welfare policy within what became the Cherokee Nation. So I looked at the development of Cherokee National Prison and the development of an orphanage on the part of the Cherokee Nation, and also public health policies, as well as an asylum for the deaf, dumb, blind, and sane, as it was called in the 19th century, but it was really a mental health facility and provided disability services. And I thought that this book was going to be much the same, that it was going to be another institutional history, but focused on education, schools. That's really what I always assumed this book would be. I knew I was going to write a book on education coming out of my PhD program at UNC Chapel Hill. And then I started teaching here, and I went into caves with a team of both archaeologists and budding archaeologists from the Department of Anthropology here. Dr. Jan Schimmick invited me to kind of consult on a project that he was working on with one of his graduate students, Bo Carroll, who is now a PhD from the University of Tennessee and is the interim Tribal Historic Preservation Officer over at the Eastern Band. And so initially they just asked me to kind of contextualize these caves and tell them about these caves that had early syllabary in them, help them understand what was going on in the community based on the documentary record. And they also offered, they said, do you want to go in the caves with us? And I said, absolutely, I'll go. And so I started going into these caves as a historian, and here are these caves with syllabary inside of them in really complex ways. So some of the syllabary is written narrative, some of the syllabary is up on the ceilings, it is doing some cosmological work. There is other syllabary in one cave site that's just single syllables all along the walls. So there's clearly different audiences for what's in the caves, and it's also meant to be read by different audiences as well. And so different writers, different audiences. And those caves really made me think, like, what am I doing? I'm writing a book on schools, and yet here's a space that indigenous peoples living in the South have been going into for millennia. That there is evidence of woodlands peoples in these caves. There's evidence of early Mississippian peoples in these caves. And here are Cherokee people going in the early 19th century at the moment of forced removal, continuing a longer tradition of indigenous peoples moving in and out of caves to do all sorts of community work. And then additionally, I took my daughter into one of these caves, and I'm grateful to have my daughter here tonight because she's a significant part of this book's process. And when you take your child on the job with you, it changes how you have to think about those spaces while you're in them. That if I was just going in wearing my historian hat, that I might ask particular kinds of questions and be attuned to particular kinds of things in those caves. But once I'm there with my child and suddenly I need to worry about her safety or remind her to go to the bathroom before we go into the caves, or that there are these very practical matters that have to happen that are both safety oriented but also parental oriented. But having her there also made me attuned to different parts of the caves, to different questions that I might ask in those spaces. And added to that, I also went to other sites. I went to older rock art sites throughout the Mississippian region more broadly. And again, my daughter is with me. And this region, just to give you a little bit of background on where some of this work is happening, is kind of where the tri-states come together, where northern Alabama meets northern Georgia meets southeastern Tennessee. So this is, we know that Tennessee is a really cave-rich area. There are over 10,000 documented caves in the state of Tennessee. Those are documented, so again, it's not as if all of them have been documented, but we've looked at a couple of these cave sites, and they forced me to think about longer chronologies as well. The caves are very old sites, so there's stalactites and stalagmites in these caves that have been formed over thousands of years. So when I'm in these spaces thinking about indigenous peoples over long spans of time, but also thinking about the land itself as an entity that we have to think about in relationship to the people that are in it, that the land itself demanded that I think about longer chronologies. And so what I thought was going to be an institutional book that began in the 19th century and really focused on Sequoia and focused on mission schools, really, I was forced back in time. That I needed to understand, how did Cherokee people conceive of, and ancestral Cherokee people conceive of education and schools and classrooms and teachers. And so I ended up adding 2 earlier chapters onto this book, but I don't necessarily have student records in the same way I might in a later period. And what I did have, and what I wound up doing was thinking about different questions and different perspectives relative to the work I'm doing, whether it was a mother having my daughter in a cave, or whether it was thinking about what is a classroom, who is a teacher in any given moment, and rethinking things that I thought were super familiar to me. So I'm going to work backward in time, or kind of throw you off chronologically by talking about a later moment and then going back to an earlier moment. But the caves down in Willstown and the areas around there have Sequoian syllabary in them in the very earliest years that it's been introduced as a writing form. And the way that we remember Sequoia and the way that he gets talked about in the records themselves is that he's a lone genius. He's a Cadmus. He is a man unto himself. He is a gifted sole proprietor of the syllabary. And this is how I've thought about him. And I think that, it fits nicely with some of the narratives of American history of kind of a bootstrapper who pulls himself up, does these incredible things. But I'm a historian, and I look at records. So I went to the earliest records we have around Sequoia. And this is one of those documents, although I found it in others. I want to kind of draw your attention down to the latter lines. The thought struck him to try to ascertain all the sounds in the Cherokee language. His own ear was not remarkably discriminating, and he called to his aid the more acute ears of his wife and children. He found great assistance from them. And this shows up in all of the earliest records surrounding Sequoyah. It's only a generation later, after Sequoyah has died, that the contributions of his wife and children morph into something else. There tends to be a little bit of a historic record around his daughter, Ayoka. There have been lots of children's books written about Ayoka, because we know in the records that she goes before the National Council with her father. And it's with him in the Cherokee National Council that they demonstrate the efficacy of the syllabary to Cherokee people. And it's only through them distancing themselves apart, him sending a note to his daughter, her reading it and conveying a message back to him, that everyone believes that this is a technology that will work and be viable for them. So we know that about her. But the way that she is often remembered is that she's a dutiful student, that she's a student of her father, and in so being, it also makes for great stories for kids. We want students to be we want them to be good learners and listeners in the classroom and attuned to whatever their teacher is saying. But when we pair the documents themselves with what's actually happening, she's not just a student, she's a co-creator. She's the ear for him to hear the sounds he can't discern, to hear the things that he needs in this moment. And I don't think that diminishes the way that we remember Sequoyah. I actually think it puts him back into our understandings of what Cherokee pedagogy looks like. The Cherokee people learned from each other in really democratic environments, and that the actual break from that would be Sequoyah inventing something on his own in solitude, at the expense of out of sight, away from his family and community. And what the records tell us is no. In fact, he co-created with his wife and children. Added to that, in one of these caves, one of the authors that we've documented, it's not Sequoyah who's writing in these caves, it's Sequoyah's son, T.C., another child who has been a student and a part of his father's process, writing in these caves. So when I started thinking about Ayoka relative to these cave sites, and thinking about children relative to these caves and Sequoyah himself, it forced me into thinking about girls more broadly. And of course, it helped that I had my daughter in some of these spaces with me, and was thinking about, like, what does her learning world look like? What did Ayoka's learning world look like? And so Ayoka, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on her, you can certainly read more about her in the book, because we don't know as much about her as I would like to know, but we know some things. And one of the ways that I wanted to think about her, and one of the ways I also wanted us to think about Sequoyah, is that she winds up being this generational bridge. That Sequoyah is born really on the cusp of the American Revolution. He's somebody who has watched the United States kind of grow up, be born, along with his mother and his grandmother. These are people who are watching the United States take shape in its earliest years. And they're also doing it in the Overhill region, so not very far from here. And so he's grown up in a region that is ultimately lost to Cherokee people about the time that Ayoka is born. But I know stories that my grandparents told me. We all probably in this room have stories that our elders have shared with us over a generation that have been carried through us. And I want us to think about her as someone in relationship not only to her parents, not only to her mother Sally, and her father, Sequoia, but also in relationship to her grandmothers. Sequoia's mother raised him on her own. There's been a lot of ink spilled on Sequoia's father, who he never had any documented relationship to. So why we have spent an enormous amount of time thinking about him as a father when he comes from a matrilineal, matrilocal society that says women determine who you are. And where we know that she has raised him in particular kinds of ways, and so have his maternal uncles in the Overhill region. And so this is also, Ayoka is born into a moment when not just Cherokee fatherhood, but when fatherhood in the young United States is being rethought. So Cherokee men are confronted with, what does it mean to be a father when previously maternal uncles were the most important men in your life? So what does Sequoia do in this moment? He's figuring out fatherhood at the same moment he's figuring out the syllabary. And so it shouldn't surprise us from someone who is rooted in a matrilineal, matrilocal system that he surrounds himself with his children as co-creators of a language. That is in keeping with older pedagogical practices. So I'm really asking readers to kind of rethink Sequoia in relationship to his Cherokee family. And in so doing, we're able to see Ayoka a bit better. I also think there's a lot of misconceptions about Sequoia that still get perpetuated. That often we think of Sequoia as being attached to the Trail of Tears. And yet, that wasn't Sequoia's experience of removal. He left before the Trail of Tears and went west. And for those of us that are Cherokee Nation citizens today, that is very often our own family histories, that we connect to people that both removed earlier because of earlier pressures, but also have family members who were forcibly removed during the Trail of Tears. So in order to tell better histories of our own families, we've got to think about the complex processes of removal and people like Sequoia who went west early, and people like Ayoka, the first student of the Cherokee language. She was the first, but she's also this co-creator. And when she moves west, she's one of the first Cherokee girls to arrive in the West. So she's seeing worlds that have yet to be seen by so many other Cherokee people. So why don't we also see her as someone who is an explorer of those new worlds in the West? So I'm belaboring Ayoka simply because she was my processual starting point. That as I started to think about Ayoka and think about what we could know about her in relationship to these caves and the documents, and that I knew my chronology was going to go earlier, and that I thought about her in relationship to these Overhill towns that she never actually lived in necessarily, but that she had core familial relationships to. And thankfully, I was here at the University of Tennessee with a great set of guides, but also a kind of larger body of archaeology that's out there for me to think about some of these things through. So for some of you, you may know Candy Hollenbach, who's in the center of this slide. Candy Hollenbach has written widely on foodways amongst indigenous peoples here in the Southeast. She does a lot of work thinking about changes in foodways as well. Tim Bowman used to be at the McClung Museum, and so I was able to interact with him while I was over there. And then the other black and white picture you see is Janet Spector, who is an early feminist archaeologist who wrote a book called What This All Means, where she's really thinking about gender, and she retells a Dakota story through the lens of a girl and these archaeological discoveries she's made around tools and tool use. So Candy Hollenbach, along with one of her co-authors, Stephen Carmody, in a piece that she wrote, writes from the perspective of a little girl in order to tell us about foodways. And I had already been experimenting with that when I went back and remembered that I had known about Janet Spector's work, but also reread and read Candy Hollenbach and Stephen Carmody's essay that kind of gave me a little more support to kind of experiment with telling a book through the lives of girls. I'm less interested in the girls per se, so much as I'm interested in their educational worlds. So I also, in order to write this book, spent some time talking to Cherokee master artists. I wanted to think about what can we know through artistry today, through the lived practices of creation that continue to be carried out in our communities. And one of the people that I reached out to is Lisa Rutherford, who's no stranger to some of the institutions around here. She comes up a lot to Sequoia Birthplace Museum, and she has been over to McClung a couple times to do some work. But she is a feather cape maker, a master artist in our community who makes feather capes. And feather capes were really only in use before the 18th century. By the 19th century, you don't see many feather capes. And they were not ubiquitous. They weren't something that every person wore. They were worn for particular ceremonies, so not everybody had one in their possession. And so what that meant is that even if you were a master cape maker, you still might not be making them regularly. And so I asked Lisa to talk to me about the process of feather cape making. And in so doing, she wrote me up this lengthy discussion of how she goes about making capes and how she learned to make capes. And she learned as an adult, which is a kind of an interesting side note as well. But she talks about, again, you can see her quote on here, and I've taken some of it out, but she actually went through and told me how many hours it takes her to make a cape. It takes days and days to make a short cape, not even a long cape. And then there's whole other parts of the process that just take additional hours on top of that. These are really arduous processes. But one of the things that I loved about her descriptions were the tactile qualities of the description. That she is one of our master artists, and because she's not making capes very often, her fingers get sore. And I thought about that in relationship to a feather cape maker in the 18th century. That if you're not making capes all the time, how do you callus your hands enough to build up the calluses that would keep you from getting sore during cape making? So I looked for these things in both archaeology, but also through kind of master artists today that enable us to see the human qualities of these processes that are durable through time, that don't necessarily go away simply because we're in a later moment. And I wanted to talk to these master artists too, because I am not somebody who is artistic. I don't have a lot of skills when it comes to my hands. I can't even sew buttons, to be perfectly honest. So I respect and admire artists who are able to carry out and enjoy and are compelled by these activities which don't compel me, but that I have a kind of fundamental respect for. And I wanted to think again about this earlier moment through other master artists. So I'm trying to highlight as many of the kind of inspirations locally as well. I was on the committee of Megan King, who was a PhD student here in the Anthropology department. She still works at Tennessee in the Student Success Center, by the way, not doing anthropology or archaeology today. But she wrote an incredible dissertation, and I was lucky enough to sit on her committee. And she specializes in lithics. And she worked with Roger and Shauna Kane, Roger is part of the United Gadua Band, one of the other 3 federally recognized Cherokee tribes. And his wife, Shauna Morton Kane, is Cherokee Nation. And they work with river cane, heavily work with river cane. And she took some lithic material to them and said, process cane with these materials. And they did. And they talked about the degree to which some of these materials were more effective than another, some better than others. But one of the things that was not in the dissertation, but that stuck out to me as a committee member, is that Roger and Shauna had favorite tools that they worked with because they fit their hands a little bit better. And at the time, my daughter was still going through Montessori here in Knoxville, And as those of us, there's some more Montessori Cherokee moms in the audience and Cherokee products of Montessori in the audience, that one of the things that Montessori emphasizes is that you have children do the things that adults do, but you don't have them do it as play, you have them do it for real. And in order to do that, you give them real tools that fit them. And so in kind of imagining a different moment, I thought about the ways that children, and I, as somebody who helped or attempted to help my dad a lot when I was a kid, having the right tools makes a difference. And so what does it mean to try to find a rock or find a shell or find a bone that is going to be the best scraper for you, or is going to be the best tool for you? And so I kind of imagined a world where we have to think about what girls are doing on the day-to-day basis, but also the kinds of the tools that they're coming to in order to accomplish those tasks. And the other thing I did in order to kind of reconstruct these worlds was I listened to Cherokee people. So I want to highlight one person who kind of helped me bring the chapter on Ayoka to an end so that I can talk to you more about Climber of Trees. But Savannah Hicks was an undergraduate here at Tennessee when I was a professor, and she is a citizen of the Eastern Band, and she participated in the 2015 Remember the Removal Ride, which is a bike ride that takes place every summer. And citizens of the Cherokee Nation come together with citizens of the Eastern Band. They train separately, and then they come together to train for a few weeks, and they retrace one of our removal routes from here to the west. And Savannah did this right after she finished undergrad, and she came back and gave a talk to undergraduates here at the University of Tennessee. And she's also done some other publicity, and she talks about the importance of these mountains to her, the only place she's ever lived and known. But when she told me privately after the talk she gave at Tennessee, she said that the most emotional part of the ride for her was when she knew it was the last day that she would see the mountains. And she turned around and looked one more time at the mountains and was overwhelmed and cried because she couldn't imagine moving on from that point. Savannah knew she was coming back in a couple weeks. Savannah had a bicycle, and Savannah felt the need to look back. That's human. That is the most kind of intimate way in which we process a place we might be losing or need to kind of look one more time at the place that we might not see for a while. And that felt like a very real, timeless experience of Cherokee people, but also of people anywhere that are leaving a place that they are attached to, that they feel they are not only from but of. And so at the close of my chapter with Ayoka, I imagine Ayoka on her move to the west looking back. What does she do? Like, has she written things down? She's literate. Has she kept them in her memory because that's what Cherokee people have always done? Has she taken these images in? And we don't know, but why can't we imagine? Why can't we take a moment to imagine what that might have been like for her, seeing those mountains one more time, just like Savannah, who was going to see them again, but needed to take a look one last time before she headed west. So doing this work around Ayoka really set me up for thinking about lots of new things. And I came back to do additional work at the University of Tennessee after I was gone, after I was already at Penn State. And I took students over to McClung quite regularly when I was teaching here. I enjoyed the collections, got to know a lot of the people over there, but I was waiting to do some research, not so much on what you're seeing on these images, mollusks. I was there to look at kind of the region around these caves, and I happened to look at the exhibit downstairs, which is on the Molluscology collection I say this all the time. Until I wrote this book, I had never heard the word molluscology in my life, okay? I didn't know one could specialize in mollusks. I didn't even think about, mollusks were not on my radar in any way, shape, or form. But I'm looking at this mollusk exhibit in the basement of McClung and got to talking to Tim Bowman about the presence of mollusks in the rivers around here. And I also looked at the primary documents. And the primary documents out of the earliest traveler accounts, out of the early ethnographies of this region, talk about the extraordinary abundance of mollusks and mollusk species that were in the rivers. You couldn't walk across the rivers without essentially walking across a bed of mollusks. That's a kind of diversity that we can't maybe appreciate today because runoff, pollution has polluted the river so much that the species are a mere fraction of what they were when these earliest travelers were coming through the region. But this would have been a part of life when DeSoto came through. For millennia, Cherokee people and ancestral Cherokees and ancestral indigenous people had been processing and engaging with the diversity of these mollusks. So that led me to really think about, like, if I'm thinking about the everyday lives of girls, they're encountering mollusks, and where are they encountering mollusks? They're encountering them in the river. What are they going to the river for? They're going to gather water, but they're also going to play. We also have lots of accounts that talk about the swimming capabilities of Cherokee children in those earliest records. So it's easy to imagine not only the rivers as a place of labor, to gather water, to wash, to do all of the things that you're doing. We also know they're places of ceremony for Cherokee people. But rivers are also a place that you can kind of go see your friends. You can sneak away. You can see who's coming to visit by canoe. That these are playgrounds in as much as they are ceremonial spaces, in as much as they are places of labor. And this was only emboldened my thinking about shell and mollusks when Tim Bowman took me to McClung's off-site warehouse. And I went into this warehouse, and there are just shelves and shelves filled with the mollusks that have come out of sites around East Tennessee as a result of the TVA damming projects. And most of these boxes have not been opened since they came out of those TVA projects. So when I opened up one of these boxes, the rubber bands collapsed in my hands. The shell has been undisturbed. No one is, again, we can imagine there aren't a lot of molluscologists out there, I'll tell you. So I had to call a couple of molluscologists and email with those molluscologists that are still out there and who specialize in these collections. And the other part of this is when I reached into these bags of shell, and you can see on my hand on the screen above, the shell powder got everywhere. I mean, it was on my hands, and of course, what did I do? I wiped it on my jeans. It's getting on my papers that I have with me. It's everywhere. And then Tim Bowman, once I was fixated on these mollusks, was like, well, there's some site reports relative to Chota and Tanasi as it relates to shell. And so he went in and he found these backside reports, not the ones that get published, but the ones that are sitting over at McClung. And one of those reports describes one of the domestic structures at Chota with a processing area of about 5 foot by 3 foot inside of a domestic structure, inside of a home. And I said to myself, who's doing work inside the home? Women and children. And then I had to extrapolate more into what's going on with the shell. Well, one of the transitions from the Mississippian period that we see more broadly is a move to using shell for temper in pottery as opposed to limestone. So you're seeing more and more shell start to make its way in as temper, which tells us a little bit about change over time, which as a historian I love, but also tells us about kind of innovations amongst women who are mostly the potters in these communities. And so I want to take a minute just to give you all of that, but now read you what I did with this material in the book itself. Because I really wanted to kind of take the archaeology, which can be very dehumanizing. It can be very pulled apart from the actual people who lived in this moment. And I couldn't live with that as a historian or as a Cherokee descendant, that I needed to humanize these materials that felt very dehumanized. And so I want to read you the section that developed from these particular materials. Water served as a powerful force in the lives of children, but it also nourished their athleticism. Mothers taught their babies to swim before they can walk, which greatly increases their strength and, of course, their growth. By the time Climber of Trees matured, she would be an able and strong swimmer who could simply swim across many streams. When Diniyoli went to water each day, they may have hauled water back to their homes in ceramic bottles, gourds, or tightly woven baskets to begin meal preparation for the day. When the river was low, Climber of Trees joined other Diniyoli to gather aquatic snails and mussels in baskets, like Ageyuja had. Volunteering to gather mollusks and water possibly served as an excuse to see friends, splash around, and see who arrived by canoe on the Little Tennessee River from neighboring towns or farther abroad. Over a century later, mollusks remained central to the everyday education of Cherokee girls. Both Ageyuja and Climber of Trees lived along rivers teeming with mollusk biodiversity. Modern-day North Carolina, where Ageyuja lived, was home to just under 100 different kinds of freshwater mollusks. Using the artificial boundaries of the modern state of Tennessee, Climber of Trees lived near 130 different kinds, but likely saw different mollusks transported by visitors and kin from other places. The fast-moving waters of the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers boast far more mollusk diversity than the Mississippi to the west and the Conestoga to the south. Climber of Trees and other community members likely hauled river mussels home to process for the community's needs year-round. In the OC, Climber of Trees likely sat toward an exterior wall on a river cane mat she had helped weave, separating the meat from the shell. The hearth stood just a few feet away, providing the heat necessary to steam open the valves. In the center of a 15-square-foot area, she placed a rock on the mat to aid her as she processed the shells into a fine or coarse powder, and then separated it through cane basket sieves she had also helped create. She encouraged her siblings to aid her with the tasks they could manage. What the younger Diniyoli likely provided was nonstop audio of the sounds of shells tinkling against one another as little hands moved them across the mound, stacked them, and let them tumble as they fell out of little piles. Shell processing, like dasadokwali harvesting, had sensorial lessons associated with them. So I'm pulling records, I'm pulling 15-square-foot areas of archaeological report to try to give life to girls and to Cherokee people in a moment that we don't necessarily have perfect records to tell us what life might be like. And I also wanted to deal with an artistic problem that I was up against. For any of you all who have gone to the newest exhibit over at McClung that was curated over there between some of the indigenous communities and some of the faculty on campus, including Lisa King in the English department, there is a way in which art can be helpful, and it has been helpful to me in thinking about the past, but we also often don't have all the images we need in order to tell us a bigger picture. So I solicited a series of images, particularly because I was creating girls from a moment when we don't necessarily have the records. And so I solicited art from Roy Boney Jr., who's a Cherokee Nation artist, to create a kind of seamless set of images of the girls using records and images that I provided him so that we could imagine what these girls might look like. And I named the girl in this chapter Climber of Trees, not because I just grabbed it. I used it because it shows up in the records as a common girl's name in the early 18th century. I used it because at my very first Cherokee National Holidays that I ever went to, I watched my cousin climb a tree on our Cherokee National Capitol and let her shoes fall to the ground. I used that name because when I was a little girl, I climbed a tree and fell flat on my back and knocked the wind out of myself. There is something timeless about the desire of children to climb trees, but it also shows up in the records. So I imaginatively tried to recreate the lives of girls through records that, again, can't give us perfect ways of seeing these girls' lives, but can give us something more, rather than just positions in graves or burial materials or where structures were at. That isn't how I come to understand and know and appreciate Cherokee history. It is through the documentary record as a historian, but it is also through the stories and lives of Cherokee people that I am lucky to be in community with. And so I brought to bear all of that together in this book. And I want to read one more account just to help you kind of think also how I'm kind of connecting this material over time. And then I'm going to wrap up, but I want to say a little bit more about Climber of Trees and her relationship to literacy, which is a big part of this book. Climber of Trees is born in a moment when we don't have the syllabary. So does that mean that she was illiterate? Absolutely not. But she's also being introduced to and thinking about literacy perhaps in some new ways. So literacy might have intrigued her because she had heard of her community's wider histories of literacy. If she had traveled the nearly 100 miles to Jukola, which some of you may know as Judacola Rock, she may have already read part of the educational landscape she shared with Agayuja. These bound materials circulating in her community may have prompted local teachers to recite portions of her history she had never heard before. Sitting in the council house, she listened to her elders recall when her, quote, ancestors first came on this land, that the priests and beloved men was writing, but not on paper, as the Europeans did, but on white deer skin and on the shoulder bones of buffalo for several years, but the proudness of the young people being so great that they would not obey the priests nor learning, but let their minds run after hunting of wild beasts, that the writing was quite lost and could never be recovered again. But if she knew about Jukola Rock, perhaps she knew that other types of literacy were still a part of the Cherokee world. If she had seen Jukola Rock or had it described to her, maybe she envisioned the designs she and her mothers and sisters incised into the soft clay of pots before firing, or thought of the designs within caves described by elders. What did she make of these teachings about the past during a time of exciting change? Climber of Trees was a young person. What responsibility did she have to bear in her community's ongoing adaptation? And what was her responsibility to continually renew its future, as her grandmother, and their grandmothers had done? So again, thinking about how we can imagine questions even if we don't have the answers to them. So the way that I have thought about language in this book, and I am not a Cherokee language speaker, I will remain perpetually a Cherokee language learner. The one kind of solace that I take in all of this is I've now been at this for a long, long time trying to learn the Cherokee language. And my daughter is enrolled in a Cherokee language course at the University of Oklahoma, and we've done some online classes together. And I think about the kind of the relationships to language over time and the kind of introduction of new literacies and the absence of other literacies. And I am convinced that my daughter is going to overtake me this semester. And that's beautiful and wonderful. Because even though I may never master it, she's a generation ahead of me going back to something older and securing a knowledge that's been around a lot longer than I have. And I think, well, what if her children decide they don't want to study it? Well, you know what? That's okay. Because maybe it's her grandchildren that are proficient yet again. And that these long chronologies enable us to not put all of this responsibility on us. That we are a part of genealogies and lineages that we can't possibly know what our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren are going to do with the knowledge that we've passed down to them. They may put it down for a while, and somebody else may pick it back up. And that gives me a lot of hope in what can sometimes feel like a hopeless moment. So I also get hope from a group that I wish had existed when I was a young mother to Lilith. And if you all are interested, I try to support this group in every way possible. There is a group of Cherokee women and Cherokee children and Cherokee mothers. So many of the women that are a part of this group are first language Cherokee speakers. They grew up speaking Cherokee first. And they have, many of them, been a part of Cherokee revitalization and Cherokee reawakening as it relates to our language most of their lives. But now we have a program that brings mothers and their babies together with these Cherokee speakers 5 days a week. And they spend all day together. And they sing and they talk to each other in Cherokee. And they cook together. And they fire beads together. And they meet with elders together. And they go out and gather harvest crops together, and they grow gardens together. And we are now on our third group of babies moving through this group. And one of the first language speakers is my aunt, who has been patient with me throughout my entire adult life as I ask ignorant questions and do ignorant things, including she caught an error on the front cover of my book in syllabary and gently sent me an email letting me know about it. But it's a reminder of older pedagogies that still live in our communities. And this group is incredible, and it's all funded by grants and funded by our nation. This is not a program that our Cherokee Nation came up with. It's a homegrown organization that is incredible. And I am enamored with them because it feels like both the past, the present, and the future of Cherokee language revitalization. And so I'm going to stop there and field questions from you all. So thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. Brandon, yeah.
So the image of looking back that you talked about in one of your students is really sort of profound. I mean, the looking back, but also looking back with the understanding of what that means, but also, because you speak a little bit about the theme of looking back, but also the responsibility of what it means to look back and bring forward.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that let me go back to my image of Ayoka. One of the things that I asked Roy to do, I didn't ask him a lot about these images. I kind of gave him just general things from each chapter and let him run with them. But the one thing I asked of him is, I said, can you please let Ayoka grow up? That she's always depicted as a 6-year-old girl. She never gets to grow up. And yet she does. She goes west. She has children. She gets married. She has grandchildren. And also thinking about her in relationship to not only this kind of earlier moment, but that when she arrives in the West, do we know exactly who she meets that's arriving later? No, but can we certainly in some capacity, she met aggrieved Cherokee people when they were arriving on the Trail of Tears. And that there would have been responsibilities attached to that, whether that was feeding people, whether that was comforting people, whether that was having people in your home who have just gone through this kind of treacherous journey. And so I think if we keep her as a little girl, we never get to see the people that move forward in time and then have a responsibility to those who will come after, quite literally come a couple years later, or come after in the sense of generations later. And that we miss those kind of really profound relationships that exist over time. And that we again, miss this piece of Cherokee history that I think is pivotal to thinking about the removal era as opposed to the Trail of Tears. Yeah.
One thing I loved when you were working on this book was getting to hear from you, like, how you chose the girls to follow throughout the book. And for those who haven't bought the book yet, can you just tell us like the sequence of the girls and kind of what inspired you to start with those, to use those girls?
Yeah, so the girls that came earliest were the girls in the earliest chapters. So Ayoka was the first girl I thought about, but she wasn't necessarily the first chapter I wrote or fully fleshed out. So I did write the first fully fleshed out chapter was the first chapter of the book, which focuses on Gadua, which some of you may know, over the mountain just outside of Bryson City, but close to Cherokee, and it is a town we consider one of our mother towns. Is it a place, it's an origin story for some Cherokee people. And so I knew that Gadua needed to be a part of the story simply because it is such a pivotal place both to the longevity of people in the region. People have been living at Gadua for 8,000 years. It's a very, very old place. And I, of course, had to create a girl in relationship to that place before the Entradas. So what would life have looked like? So I experimented first with her, kind of walking through and presenting drafts, and of course Kristen already knows. She knows about this early draft, but I didn't always know what girls were going to emerge. So I have the chapter on Gadua and Agayuja, and Agayuja really literally translates to girl in Cherokee. And then I created Climber of Trees to kind of work through this Chota and Tanasi period in the early decades of the 18th century. We have a lot more records on the mid-18th century at Chota and Tanasi. And then I knew that Ayoka was going to be the girl for chapter 3. It just seemed too obvious. My girl for chapter 4 was a girl named Caroline Matilda Fields, who winds up at Dwight Mission, which is our oldest mission school in what becomes Indian Territory in the Cherokee Nation out west. And that school actually is opened in Indian Territory the same year that Sequoyah builds his cabin in the west. So there was this, and they're actually neighbors to each other in the grand scheme of things. But one thing that happened with that chapter is I kept getting confused in the records because I couldn't figure out how to trace out Caroline Fields, and then I discovered that there were 2 Caroline Fields at Dwight Mission. So I ended up having to reconfigure the chapter to sort each of them out because they have a little bit different trajectories. But I also thought it was nice because this is the same area that Ayoka arrives to. So that's where she's living. This is the region she would have come to know immediately, and here you have these girls arriving later and attending Dwight Mission. For the next chapter, I focused on my great-great-grandmother, and I knew that I was going to have a chapter on her. She attended Dwight Mission in a very different moment, so I actually have Dwight Mission in there twice, but it's also to make the point that a school is not the same place from one generation to another, that schools are really dependent on who the teachers are, what the community demographics are, what the student demographics are, what the economic situation is at the time, who's governing. That all of these things can change a school even if the building might be the same. But I could also put them in conversation with the community writ large. So what does it mean that you have a Ayoka who's never attended a school living in the same community with Dwight Mission? These are two different educational trajectories for Cherokee girls in a post-removal moment. So my great-great-grandmother attended this school in a later moment. She was born in 1899 and was an original allottee. My family still lives on her allotment in Indian Territory. We did not lose our allotment through the kind of land grabs in Oklahoma. And she's somebody that I don't remember, but she is a part of my life and always has been through kind of the stories and experiences and documents that she has left behind. I focused a chapter on my dad's sister, my Aunt Joanne, who part of why I wanted to think about education is that my father never went to college. My father went straight into the military out of high school. My mom had a master's degree by the time I was born in education, and their educational lives and their relationship to education were so radically different that I couldn't square those as a child. And so what does it mean to have these two people with very different relationships to schooling and education and intellectual activities? And so tracing my aunt also enabled me to kind of think through these real problems of my own childhood relative to hearing about my dad's experiences of school. And my aunt could talk to me. I could ask her about school. I could ask her about her life. And interestingly enough, my aunt and my dad were the first generation in their family to go to public schools. So everyone else in my Cherokee side of the family either went to mission schools or boarding schools or Cherokee Nation schools. And so this was a moment where they were shifting to a public school model in the state of Oklahoma, and that was a horrific experience for my father. And it was a kind of horrific experience for my aunt who cared about my dad, but who did well in school, watching my dad go through that. And then the final chapter, the final chapter of the book, I had gotten through my aunt's childhood, was well into the 1950s, and I was spent. We're often trying to get the second book out. And my editor came up to Penn State for another event, and we had a meeting, and I said, I've got to stop in the 60s. I'm done. I can't look at the archival records anymore. There's too much. I haven't looked at them. I don't know who the girl is. And this was November of 2022, and he said, but you do know who the girl is. And I said, no. And then had to sit with that like, why is my great-grandmother subjected to kind of having her life turned over in my work? And my aunt is subjected to having me turn over her life in my work, but somehow I'm off limits. And 2 weeks later, my dad died. And I didn't want to, that particular chapter of the book also feels, you're reading my grief as I processed the loss of my father. You're reading, I have a childhood archive that I kept from the time I was about 3, and I pulled archival materials out of this childhood archive and used them in that final chapter of the book. But I also realized that on the one hand, writing this, my own childhood, in some ways is representative of Cherokee young people today. My daughter basically never lived in a Cherokee community. I didn't either growing up because my dad was military. So it is not uncommon for Cherokee people today to have not lived in their community. And at the same time, I know lots of people that the only place they've lived is in their community. And so recognizing that my experience was both representative but unrepresentative, I asked a couple of my friends to talk me through their childhoods, people that were born at the Hastings Hospital in Oklahoma, which they will joke, are you really Indian if you weren't born at this hospital? But talk me through their childhoods, people that are my peers, people that the only place they knew was growing up in the Cherokee Nation. And that enabled me to kind of put these educational worlds out there as there isn't a singular education that Cherokee people are getting at any moment in time, but that it is particularly poignant in certain moments to think about the kinds of education that Cherokees are working through. Mine was interesting too. It hadn't occurred to me until I was writing this book that I attended Department of Defense schools. And I'd always kind of thought of myself as a product of public schools. but Department of Defense schools are federal. And it was jarring when I started looking at these federal education reports because there are two types of federal education: Indian boarding schools and DoD schools. And there are radically different outcomes for the children in Indian boarding schools than there are in DoD schools. And at the same time, knowing what we know about military service of Native American people, it also suggests we don't know the full story of Indian education if we're not thinking about Native kids who are the products of DoD schools. And so I think there's a lot of really interesting questions that I am still pondering about what that means to think about federal education in ways that are moving us. I think the boarding schools are incredibly important. And we cannot turn our backs on kind of the legacies of mission and boarding schools in this country. But there's a different kind of assimilation program happening in the military. There's a different kind of hierarchy being constructed, but there are lots of similarities between those two educational experiences, and yet the outcomes are radically different. So wrote through these girls and struggled. And so, the final chapter is deeply personal. There are parts of my life that even my great uncle said to me, "You never told me about this." And I was terrified writing through that chapter because we as academics are often performing. We often kind of come to the table and we have audiences in front of us and we're thinking about what we look like or how we sound or how are we going to be received, and yet that is a fraction of who we are as human beings. And so being seen is often not something we really want to do with other human beings, and yet I think now is a moment when we really need to see each other. Yeah, Vicki.
I'm struck by how you speak about the girls as sort of like, I don't know, coming out of the archives, right, in a way, and like emerging from your research. And I was wondering about the process of doing your research. Were there ever like boys who started to emerge out of these records that you were like, oh, this is a really interesting story I'd like to tell too? Do you think about exploring sort of boyhood as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think, boys are not absent from the story.
Yeah.
So, I think about the relationships between brothers and sisters, and I think about the relationships of again, kind of whose responsibility is it to do education and for what. One thing that I did think about a lot, and I spent a lot of time writing about, is the introduction of mission schools in the early 19th century. And education had, even within a kind of pre-mission, Euro-American context, education had gendered components to it. There were things that women tended to do, there were things that men tended to do. However, when the boarding schools get introduced or the mission schools get introduced, it's fascinating to think about the ways that the schools themselves are setting policy that either limit or enable certain kinds of activities. So stickball, for any of you that know Cherokee sport more broadly, is a game that's still played over on the Boundary pretty regularly. Some colleges have had stickball teams, but stickball was an activity that men were expected to participate in. And when the missions first arrived, there were often stickball games attached to ceremonial cycles. And you saw the missionaries kind of essentially set a vacation time that coincided with some of these ceremonial calendars that would have also enabled these boys to go play stickball. But this is a moment when the missions have just arrived, and they're fragile, right? There's no guarantee that people are going to continue to support these missions and that Cherokees will send their children. And so they grant this vacation. It also looks good on their books because if they suddenly document that all of these boys disappear from classes, they have to keep a record to kind of continue arguing for finances, and they're not about to do that. But within 10 to 15 years of arriving, they are ostracizing boys. There are boys who are coming to ask permission to go participate in stickball games who are shut down and then are left with the choice. Do I go and participate in what I'm expected? You know, you've got kind of dual degrees going on, right? Like you're supposed to be getting this education, but you also need this education. And there's boys that get expelled for going to participate, even though they've sought permission from the missionaries. And really, it's not even, it's interesting to think about, like, what is the punishment for? Well, yes, it's because they went to play stickball, but it's also because the boys went and played stickball when they were told not to. So it's the hierarchy of the school of, like, you need to listen to adults, you need to listen to these adults, and if you deviate from listening to those adults, even if other adults are out there encouraging you, that breaking the rules is what's going to get you expelled from school. And so I do think a lot about when boys are being pulled back. In the post-removal period, there's a boy that is struck by lightning gathering strawberries in the post-removal period. He's killed. And this is kind of a larger moment where boys are not attending school. They're performing labor in the community. They're farming. And if we look at records from the 18th century, there's accounts of people arriving and seeing women across strawberry fields gathering strawberries. So clearly something has changed in that boys are out gathering strawberries and doing this agricultural labor and gathering that had been women's labor, had been women's roles just 50 years earlier. And so I do try to tease out what's happening with boys as well. But I also think that part of the reason I wanted to focus on girls is that I think we often, and we do this in larger women's history more broadly, is that we talk about the role of women, or we say that kind of women are important, or if we think about American history where it's like, oh, women, these Republican mothers that are supposed to help educate and give morals to their sons and help them be good citizens, that there's a way in which we kind of honor mothers, give kind of a little bit of lip service to mothers, but we don't really pay attention to what they're actually doing. We don't pay attention to the labor that makes everything happen that's out publicly taking place, that the labor of women that makes a national council happen, the labor of, and this is one thing that is continuous, the language labor of women, the interpreting that women do over long spans of time, where part of the reason that they're wanted for this is so they don't have to be paid. So the free labor of women that is making treaty negotiations happening, that are making national council meetings, that are making communities be able to talk to each other. All of this kind of labor behind the scenes that we say, oh, women, yes, matrilineal, matrilocal, but what does that actually look like? What does it actually mean? And I wanted, again, to kind of see that labor and think about what women are actually doing over time.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Julie. This has been, my mind is just buzzing with everything. I really appreciated that you started off with acknowledging your writing group and telling us about some of the inspiration. Can you talk a little bit about the process? Like, I'm really thinking, not only are you an amazing historian, but also you're thinking a lot about writing. So if you can talk some about that process and those conversations and just like what that looks like as a writer to bring all, because I know it's a ton of work to figure out how to do that.
So one of the statements I make, and there's always one time that I start crying when I talk about this book. Usually it's about my dad. I used to be a writer. And that was one of the things that going through my childhood archive, seeing all the writing that I did, that I was compelled by, and that I experimented with writing. So, it was, yes, I wrote a lot of journaling for years and years. I journaled, right? But creative writing, fiction, op-eds, that I was I wrote my way through young adulthood. And then I went to graduate school. And it wasn't that I stopped writing, it's that I stopped being a writer. And so one of the things that I did say to my editor, both in the book, but I've also said to him privately, is I said, thank you for letting me try to be a writer again. That, you know, there are so many expectations of how we write within the historical profession. And let me just stop and say, I actually think historians are better writers than most of the people in the academy. I want to give us kudos. I do think we're a lot clearer than some of those theory-laden folks. And some of us use theory, I do not. But I do think we get a bad rap. But also that that one of the ways that many of our students and also many of us come to history is through stories, right? Is through the narratives that we've been told and the stories of who we are and the stories of other people. And that can be a much harder task for those of us that are worrying about evidence and worrying about arguments. And of course, I had to stop at various points writing the book and go, what's the argument? And even when I wrote that last chapter, that's where the most cuts happened. So there was probably about 35 pages that are gone from that chapter, but not because I cut them, because I had to say to my editor, you've got to cut because everything's important to me, right? But to kind of tailor it back both for an audience purposes and to hone in on kind of what the big themes of the book were. But also, I would be like, what's the argument again? But also, one of the discoveries I made is like, I actually have a strength in writing from the first person, which is also not something we are necessarily encouraged to do as historians. And so what do I do with that in future writing? I'm co-authoring a book with Rose Stremlau, and we have struggled with this as we started writing together again. What voice are we going to use together? And so I'm still kind of working with the first person in some of my early drafts of material to see what that feels like and sounds like, and then shifting it over. But I think writing is hard, and it's deeply personal, and it's processual. We have to do it again and again and again. And, I'd forgotten I was a writer. Yeah, Kim.
So as a Indigenous female author who wrote a book in English,
Mm-hmm.
how did you, and researched in English written by cis white men, which conflicts quite often with Cherokee ideology and perspective, how did you tease out the Indigenous from the works written by somebody that was not immersed in culture
Mm-hmm.
and community? And then how did you choose to convey your words in a way that spoke to Cherokee ideology without using Cherokee? Because it's so hard to translate to English from
Mm-hmm.
Cherokee. So how did you approach that
Yeah.
and not lose your mind?
Yeah. I think the book would have been different if I was a Cherokee speaker, right? That there's no doubt about it, that I would have been able to convey things that I simply couldn't convey. But I also think that I couldn't have written this book 20 years ago, that the ability to write this book has come from listening deeply to both Cherokee speakers, but listening to Cherokee speakers try to interpret Cherokee epistemologies into English for my benefit, right? So, thinking about, even on the first page of the first chapter, but Tom Belt, who Kim knows and others may know, but Tom Belt is a Cherokee Nation citizen, but who's been living over at the Eastern Band for probably 30 years now. And he's a first language Cherokee speaker. And he has said to me many times over the years that you can be from a place, and that's different than being of a place. And there is something simple about that in English and something profound about it that does get at something else relative to the relationships between Cherokee people and and these mountains. Because he said to me, we may be from Oklahoma, but we're of this place. And that's different. But listening to, thinking about some of the stories that a cousin shared with me who'd been raised by raised with and around my great-grandmother, that she was terrified of rivers. And part of the reason that she was terrified of rivers is because, again, born in 1899, she saw the Uktena, which is a kind of horned snake that Cherokee people believe is very powerful and lives in these mountains. And there are still ceremonies carried out relative to the presence of the Uktena. And she asked her parents, how on earth did she see the Uktena in a river in the West? And their answer was, it followed us here. That is something that is both, again, not necessarily, I think it would have been explained different to me if it was done in Cherokee, but I think there's still something profound about the relationship that my great-grandmother had to rivers as a Cherokee person because of these longer histories that she had as a Cherokee person. So I tried to listen to as much as I could relative to the people that are around me that may not be speakers, but that I understand to be deeply rooted in Cherokee culture and Cherokee society and Cherokee ceremony, that know some things I don't. And yet, I mean, to your point, I still have work to do, right? Like that there are still little things that, as I continue to work on the Cherokee language, I think about all the time. Like, I'm still hoping to decolonize the University of Oklahoma because I just learned last week that there's a word for boomers, which some of you may know, the small red squirrels, in the Cherokee language. And I'm like, we need to implement that at an OU and get rid of that schooner. But there are ways and conceptions that we've got to kind of think through that may not be perfect, but that we can try to approximate, and it's imperfect, I recognize. But I'm gonna keep listening to Cherokee people that know things that I don't, and that's what I tried to do throughout the book. One of the things I'm really proud of relative to this book is the number of Cherokee people who were in my footnotes. That it's easy to kind of just footnote all the scholars, and they're there. I mean, to your point, those guys with the problematic records are there. But I took seriously the voices and the skills and the intellect of Cherokee people that I know who don't have PhDs, but who have PhDs to me.